Today I'm going to be talking about Wicked, the life and times of the Wicked Witch of the West. Part 1. Munchkinlanders. In the land of Oz, a green-skinned girl named Elphaba Throp is born to her religious father Frexbar and her lonely mother Melina. Elphaba spends the first several years of her childhood living in Munchkinland with her parents, her mother's old nurse Nanny, and her mother's lover, a quadling named Turtleheart. Her childhood was a rough one, as her green skin made her a social outcast and her parents were completely repulsed by her. It is around this time that the wizard arrives and begins to take over Oz. Throughout the remainder of her childhood, Melina gives birth to her second child, Nessarose, who is born with no arms. Following the death of Turtleheart, Melina and Frex decide to move their family to Quadling Country. Melina later dies whilst giving birth to her third child, Shell. Elphaba spends the rest of her childhood looking after her sister and following after her father in his work as a missionary. Part 2. Gillikin. Fast forward several years and the story picks up during Elphaba's time at college. She attends Shiz University and eventually befriends her roommate, Glinda. It is during her time at Shiz that the wizard begins to restrict the rights of animals. Brief aside. I briefly need to explain the difference between animals and animals. Animals with a capital means that these animals can speak. Animals without a capital means they cannot speak. For the remainder of this video, I will only be talking about these kinds of animals. Elphaba's favorite professor at Shiz University is Dr. Dillamond, a goat who is a prime animal rights activist in Oz. Dr. Dillamond's fight for equality and eventual murder for his beliefs has a strong effect on Elphaba, which will stay with her for the rest of her life. The death of Dr. Dillamond also establishes Madame Morrible, the school's headmistress, as one of the main antagonists of our story. She is very openly supportive of the wizard in his plans to rid society of the presence of animals, and she is also revealed to have been the one to conspire to have Dr. Dillamond murdered. I don't like that woman. Nessarose arrives at Shiz a few years following Elphaba, and to celebrate her arrival, her father Frexbar sends her a beautiful pair of silver slippers. Or red if you're a fan of the movie. Elphaba is resentful of this gift and her father's obvious favoritism of Nessarose. One day, Elphaba, Nessa, and Glinda are called to Madame Morrible's office where she tries to recruit the girls to work as secret spies for the wizard. Elphaba and Glinda then travel to the Emerald City to have an unpleasant meeting with the wizard himself. Instead of returning to Shiz with Glinda, Elphaba resolves to stay in the Emerald City where she joins the secret rebellion against the wizard. Part 3. City of Emeralds. Several years after joining the rebellion, Elphaba reunites with Fiyero, an old friend from Shiz, and the two begin having an affair. Working alongside the rebellion, Elphaba tries and fails to assassinate Madame Morrible, and Fiyero is then murdered by the secret police because of his association with Elphaba. This affects her very deeply. Part 4. In the Vinkus. In the aftermath of Fiyero's death, Elphaba joins a convent and enters a year-long coma due to her grief. It is here that she gives birth to Lear, her and Fiyero's son. After several years of working in the convent, Elphaba, with Lear in tow, travels to Fiyero's home in the Vinkus, attempting to apologize to his wife, Sarima. Elphaba, Lear, and Nanny spend several years living with Sarima, her sisters, and Fiyero's 3 children. Unfortunately, the wizard's forces arrest and kill Sarima and her family. There's a lot of death in this book. Part 5. Murder and its Afterlife. Elphaba, having assumed the title of Witch after leaving the convent, now begins to practice magic. Meanwhile, Nessarose has assumed her family's title of Ruler of Munchkinland, a right that would have gone to Elphaba but was passed on to Nessa after her sister's disappearance. However, Nessarose is killed when the House of Dorothy Gale falls on her head during a tornado. Elphaba returns to Munchkinland for the funeral, where she finds out that Glinda has given Nessarose's slippers to the girl Dorothy before she set off for the Emerald City. The witch is then called for a meeting with the wizard. It is here that she learns that he is from another world, and she also learns that he is her biological father. After her meeting with the wizard, Elphaba becomes obsessed with Dorothy Gale and retrieving her sister's shoes. Upon arriving in the Emerald City, Dorothy is instructed to kill Elphaba. Only then will the wizard help her in her quest to return home to Kansas. Dorothy and her friends then travel to the Vinkus Castle, Sarima's home, where Elphaba has stayed for many years. After a rather tense confrontation, Dorothy accidentally kills Elphaba by melting her with water. It is then that Elphaba dies, and she is remembered by everyone in Oz as the Wicked Witch of the West. So the first 4 sections of this novel are named after core locations in Oz, with all of them being combined in Part 5, Murder and its Afterlife. The different places the protagonist visits in her life represent key events that led her to become the Wicked Witch of the West. Munchkinland represents Elphaba's family. Her mother's rejection of her, her father's absence and favoritism of Nessarose, the constant burden of looking out for her sister due to her disability, and the younger brother she never had the chance to get to know. Gillikin represents the cause she spends the rest of her life fighting for. Elphaba worked closely with Dr. Dillerman in his research. Amidst all the oppression the animals were facing, he was trying to scientifically prove that humans and animals are not very different after all. After all their hard work, and just as Dillerman was about to announce an enormous breakthrough, he was murdered in cold blood, and then it was made to look like an accident. The Emerald City represents her heartbreak. For the first and only time in her life, Elphaba found someone who truly loved her. Fiyero risked his title, his marriage, his children, and eventually lost his life because of his love for Elphaba. The death of her lover haunts her for the rest of her life. The Vinkus represents her guilt. Elphaba travels to the castle of Kiyomiko to beg Sarima, Fiyero's wife, forgiveness for her involvement in his death. However, Sarima is reluctant to hear Elphaba's statements and constantly puts off the conversation. Elphaba spent years at Kiyomiko trying to apologize, but was never able to do so. After pushing the matter aside for so long, Sarima and her family are kidnapped and Sarima is killed, leaving Elphaba to bear the weight of her guilt forever. The final section of the novel brings Elphaba back to each of these places that defined who she became. She abandons her father while he is still sick with grief over the death of Nessarose. She returns to Shiz University and murders a now aged Madame Morrible as she lays on her deathbed. She stalks Dorothy Gale on the outskirts of the Emerald City and listens on as they whisper and gossip about her. Finally, she returns home to the Vinkus, where Dorothy Gale, frightened, tries to apologize for her involvement in the death of Elphaba's sister. However, the day ends with Dorothy returning to the Emerald City and the Wicked Witch of the West nothing more than a puddle on the floor. There are many topics addressed in Wicked, and each one is well handled and work to augment the overall story. This universe is incredibly unique because Oz has its own belief system and different forms of religious views, as is the case in real life. The world of Wicked presents 4 unique religions: Lurlinism, Unionism, the Pleasure Faith, and TikTokism. For the majority of the novel, these religions are able to coexist without much conflict between different views. Any and nearly all conflicts regarding religion are either caused by Frexbar or Nessarose. Elphaba is a self-proclaimed atheist, which often causes tension between her and her father. Frex is a unionist minister who often places his religious beliefs above his duty to his family. Nessarose was very engaged in the unionist faith throughout her childhood and into her college years. However, when she became ruler of Munchkinland, she began to practice magic. Magic is frowned upon by the unionist religion, and this began to steer Nessa more on the path of the pleasure faith. Equality for all people is a very prominent subject in our world today, and it is not taken lightly in the world of Wicked. The most commonly discussed form of oppression in the novel comes in the form of animals and the constant restriction of their rights. However, there is also the case of the Quadlings and those who reside in Winky Country. In the novel, Quadlings are made to represent the lowest grade of human. Their land is underdeveloped, and eventually their ecosystem is destroyed by the wizard's forces as they are ravishing the land for hidden riches. The proper name for Winky Country is the Vinkus. It is revealed in the novel that Winky is a derogatory term in the land of Oz. The Vinkus is inhabited by several strong and proud tribes, including the Skrull, the Unamata, and the Arjiki. As previously mentioned, the most prominent form of inequality is amongst the animal population in Oz. The wizard strongly despises animals and campaigns that all animals should be seen and not heard. Slowly, he begins reducing their rights, making public services, including transportation, more expensive so that they are only accessible to those who can afford them. Immediate rejection from even the most standardized of jobs if the applicant is an animal, similarly to a vision that Elphaba sees of the wizard trying to get a job back in his own world under the restrictions Irish need not apply. As for the animals who had already secured their careers, they were either driven to resign or fired under false accusations. A strong advocate for the animals was Dr. Dillerman. However, after his death, there was no one left to fight the wizard for their rights. Eventually, animals were treated as nothing more than common livestock, sold amongst farmers or killed for meals. Any animal that was deemed less desirable by the general public was snuffed out, leaving the remainder to go into hiding. The common enemy of all of these forms of inequality is ignorance. The influence of the wizard has turned the people of Oz into a closed-minded populace who are no longer able to accept the things that they do not understand. The overarching theme of Wicked is the nature of good and evil. One cannot simply be defined as solely good or evil. There is often much more lying beneath the surface. In the classic tale The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the witch is established as the antagonist of Dorothy's story from her very first appearance. There is no explanation provided as to what led her to become so wicked. After she arrives in Munchkinland, Glinda gives Dorothy the magic slippers that belong to the deceased Witch of the East. Having lost her sister's slippers, the Wicked Witch of the West now targets the young girl and her friends for the rest of their journey in Oz. The story of Wicked was created to provide an explanation as to how Elphaba became the Wicked Witch of the West. As we now know, she endured many hardships in her life which left her feeling constantly rejected, isolated, worthless, and defeated. She lived her entire life on the outside, always looking in, with no way of ever breaking the barrier. From the earliest stages of her life, she was viewed as an abomination. Her Unionist parents believed that she was a punishment sent by the unnamed god for their sins. However, Elphaba was only a girl who was blamed for every single mistake she made, none of which were outside the barriers of regular child behavior, except for the time that she bit her midwife's finger off. She was ridiculed for every aspect of her existence, which had a long-lasting effect on her personality as she grew older. When she moved on to college, later leaving Shiz to become an animal rights activist, she was labeled as a public enemy, wanted dead or alive by the wizard. Anyone who associated themselves with her was killed by the secret police. Such was the case of Fiyero, whose death was left permanently unexplained because any traces of the murder were wiped away. Rude! In her later years, her sister began to practice sorcery and was labeled the Wicked Witch of the East. Elphaba, having assumed the guise of a witch after leaving the convent, was thus dubbed the Wicked Witch of the West. She had been living under the title of the Wicked Witch of the West years before she tried her hand at sorcery, which, combined with her medical abilities and Dr. Dillamond's notes, allowed her to perform the surgical procedures which created the flying monkeys. At the end of the novel, the question we are left to wonder is, could Elphaba truly be described as wicked? She overcame the torments of her family and her childhood. She refused to be confined to a place like Shiz that never accepted her because of the way she looked, and openly fought against the things that she believed in. She fearlessly left her past behind, joining a cause that was fighting for an entire population who was being ignored, having their rights taken away and swept under the rug as if they never existed. She spent the majority of the rest of her life trying to apologize to Fiyero's wife for the part she played in her husband's death. After Sarima and her family are kidnapped, Elphaba works non-stop trying to find a way to get them back, heartbroken when the news is delivered that they have been killed. Finally, she spends her last days chasing after her sister's shoes. Before Dorothy's house fell on her, Nessarose promised to leave the shoes for Elphaba, and Glinda gave them away. The shoes are all she has left of her sister, and she believed that the hidden magic inside of them was dangerous and could not be allowed to fall into the hands of the wizard. So that is my lingering question for you. Do you believe that the Wicked Witch of the West was ever truly wicked at all? Personally, I think that she is tortured, corrupted by all the things she had to face in her life. However, I don't believe that there is any point in the novel that I can ever describe her as evil. That I can describe her as wicked.